strong and consistent pro-life voting record in the Congress. You believe in the inherent and equal dignity of all members of the human family, including the child in the womb. So I'm wondering whether, in view of those delegated powers, you would, as President, propose to Congress appropriate legislation pursuant to the 14th Amendment to protect life in all stages and conditions, or do you believe that you would have to wait for the Supreme Court to reverse itself in Roe versus Wade before you could do that?
No, I wouldn't wait for a constitutional amendment. I wouldn't wait for Roe versus Wade to be reversed, but I would, remove the jurisdiction from the federal court so the states could immediately do what they want, and we wouldn't have wasted the last 10 years trying to stop the abortion. But when you refer and use the 14th Amendment, it implies that the 14th Amendment repealed the 9th and the 10th Amendment, and I don't quite read that into that. The people who use the 14th to do almost anything they want because it's now a federal government. And it is true, the 14th Amendment has been used to increase the size and scope of the federal government, which I disagree with because I think it should be held at the local level. But in no way should you interpret the 14th Amendment as repealing the 10th Amendment in particular.
Well, it's certainly true that any constitutional provision can be abused, and many of them have been abused. But the language of the 14th Amendment is very clear. It says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny to any person the equal protection of the laws.
But if that were the case, they would have taken, no states would be involved in dealing with murder, injuries, second-degree murder, manslaughter, robbery, armed robbery. Everything is still states. So if you just can't pick out one, you should have no state laws against murder. Under your circumstances, this should be a federal issue.
Well, only if the murder laws are being denied to the protection of the murder laws are being denied to a class of people. So, for example, if the state withdrew its protections against killing, if the person killed is of a certain race or ethnic group, then certainly under the 14th Amendment, the national government would be empowered to act. So if it withdraws its protection, the state withdraws its protection from a class of human beings, let's say the unborn, or if it were the newly born or handicapped newborns, wouldn't that call for, not only permit, but call for action at the national level under Section 1 of the 14th Amendment?
If you wanted to stretch the interpretation and enhance the power of the central government rather than enhancing the power of the local government because they deal with all acts of violence, I mean, I think they're quite capable of doing it. Some of these things are more difficult. Some states have capital punishment, some places don't, and I can understand your argument, but I think it really rejects the notion that the states were part of this republic that we created. So if you get gradualism of sending more and more, soon as the Interstate Commerce Clause, soon as the General Welfare Clause, and I think when we can, and we certainly can, we've done it for all our history to deal with violence and murder. This has always been a state issue, and I don't see why we would have to turn that into a federal issue. Matter of fact, the founders never even thought we should have, a federal police force, but we do. We have a federal police force, and you're sort of asking for more policemen, at the federal level, and I don't understand why we've met so much resistance on returning the jurisdiction or removing the jurisdiction from the federal courts. If we'd have done that 10 years ago, you'd have say millions and millions of abortions being done because the states could have prohibited it right away. You could have done it with a majority vote with the president signing it. You wouldn't have had to wait for the Constitution to be changed. You wouldn't have to wait for Roe versus Wade to be repealed by the courts.
Well, Congressman Paul, if I can shift to another issue. Poverty is a reality in the United States of America. Unfortunately, we're the greatest, wealthiest country in the world. We know that past well-intentioned efforts, especially at the federal level, to fight poverty with big bureaucratized government-run programs have not been effective. Often they've done more harm than good. But does that mean that there is no role for the national government in fighting poverty, or do you see some role that the national government would play? If not, should this be a state issue, or is this an issue simply for private charity? What's your view?
Obviously, it should be a state issue. It shouldn't be a federal issue because you even admitted it doesn't work very well. So, no, it should be a state issue, but it has a responsibility. If you understand the economic environment that is necessary that the federal government can create, sound money, don't over-regulate, don't overtax, don't run up deficits. That's the environment that the federal government creates, destroys the job. That whole system of taxation and monetary policy sends our jobs overseas. So yes, they have a responsibility, but to say, well, all right, yes, there's only a few people who need our help, so we're going to give food stamps for the very needy. Well, what happens is you give food stamp for the very wealthy, and you endorse that principle 100%.
We're running out of time, but is time up? I'm very sorry, David. Yes, thank you,
very much, Congressman Ron Paul.
Thank you.
And next, former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. And let me mention one thing. Let me mention one thing. If you would not flash balls for cameras, it would be greatly appreciated. It's bothering some of the folks up here.
Steve. Hi. Thank you. Hi. Robbie. Hi.
Governor Romney, 3 minutes for your opening statement.
Well, you know, the older I get, the more I appreciate the extraordinary brilliance of the founders of this country. Because they not only changed the relationship between citizen and government, because the nations from which they had sprung, if you will, as the first individuals to come to this country, had the king as the sovereign and the citizens were the servants. And they said, no, we're going to make the citizens the sovereign, and the government's going to be the servant. And they went on to say, we're going to have not just political freedom, but also economic freedom and personal freedom. So we would be free not just to choose the people who would represent us, but also free to choose our course in life. And by virtue of those two freedoms and others, this became the place on the planet over the last couple hundred years where every pioneer, every innovator wanted to come. And come they did, by the millions. It's what made America the most powerful economic engine in the history of the world. And the principles that we had, this love of freedom, we shared with others. This nation has changed the world in part because of the brilliance of these founders, with political freedom and economic freedom. And they went on. They came up with the idea of federalism, which, contrary to the way it sounds, is the idea that states would have the rights to solve those problems that were closest to the people. And so education and caring for the poor and health care would be solved at the state level. States compete. As Justice Brandeis said, the states would be the laboratories of democracy. This is the heart of what makes America such an extraordinary engine of economic vitality and greatness. And what I see right now in Washington, and have over the last several decades, is the belief there that somehow Washington knows better than the people, that the sovereign ought to go back to being government, not the people. And the reason I see us struggling economically is because Washington has become too assertive, too big, too demanding on the lives of the American people. We simply have to rein back government to be what it was when it was considered by the founders, which is a source of encouraging the private sector, encouraging states, encouraging individuals to live with their freedoms and build a better tomorrow for themselves and for their kids. That's the job that has to be done. And I look at this administration, I don't think I've ever seen an administration who's gone further afield from the Constitution and from those principles I've described than the Obama administration. Not just with regulation, but with energy policy, with financial regulatory policy, and also with the worst example, Obamacare, which is a massive intrusion not only in the rights of states, but in the rights of citizens. And so what we got to do is repeal Obamacare and a lot of other regulation and legislation this administration has put through in order to go back to the principles that made this country what we are. Personal freedom, economic freedom, political freedom. This is the greatest nation in the history of the earth. I love America. I'm going to return America to those principles that made us that great nation. Thank you.
Representative King.
Thank you, Governor. I'm living proof that a king is not sovereign. And you're astute on the financial issues, and I would just ask point blank, Would you repeal Dodd-Frank?
Yeah. Dodd-Frank, there are some provisions in it that needed to be updated, and it was appropriate for us to think about the regulation of the financial services sector. Look, the regulation of the mortgage industry was just not up to date. Derivatives, which few people can understand, we were way out of date with thinking about regulating those areas. We also had to ask ourselves, what's the right amount of capital that should go behind the assets that various institutions have? These are valid questions, and so it was appropriate for Congress to perhaps write a 10 or 20-page bill. But 2,300 pages with a complete rework of the financial services sector did the one thing which the banking sector couldn't live with. It created such uncertainty that the bankers, instead of making loans and encouraging the economy in a time of distress, pulled back. And I think, and part of that flows from the fact that the people who were putting that together, Dodd and Frank, the two people who, as much as anyone I know in this country, were responsible for the meltdown that we had.
I'm glad that's said, Mitch.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that we'd ask those two who were responsible for the committees overseeing banking, we'd say to them, okay, why didn't you write the legislation to change things? It's like, well, they should have started by saying, okay, we'll resign and let someone else do the job. And so I'd say, Representative, I say, do we need financial regulation? Of course. But we need it streamlined, modernized, up-to-date, not overwhelming and burdensome in such a way that it frightens our financial services sector from being able to make the loans that small business in particular need.
Would you even incrementally privatize Fannie and Freddie?
The answer is yes. I mean, I look at Fannie and Freddie and just think that obviously they've grown massively beyond the scope that had been envisioned for them originally. Why the federal government is in the business of providing guarantees for over half the mortgages in the country, it's extraordinary. And how they could have done what they did. We all heard about these things called liar loans, where people didn't have to tell what their real income was, and they didn't have to show income statements. They didn't have to put any money down. Most people thought that was what, 1 or 2% of the mortgages that were being originated? It turned out in 2007 to be almost half of the mortgages originated. I mean, the failures of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Barney Frank, Chris Dodd are just so legion that we really have to rethink about how we're going to support a growing housing industry.
Would you repeal the Community Reinvestment Act?
Absolutely. That was a disaster from the get-go. And look, I understand. And by the way, this is not just Democrats. There's people on both sides of the aisle who touted for a long time the idea that we want to put people in homes, and we're going to encourage people getting in homes and get banks to make loans to people who otherwise wouldn't qualify, and recognize when you make loans to individuals or businesses that don't qualify on their merits for a loan, you're adding risk. And maybe you can do that with 1% of the population. When you start doing it for half of all the loans going out, you're putting such risk in the system that when something happens, when one of the cards in this house of cards gets pulled out, the whole enterprise could fall, and we're still suffering from it.
You have a chance to run the table, Governor. Sarbanes-Oxley.
Well, Sarbanes-Oxley is one of the worst examples of what has happened to what's known as the middle market in America. The Wall Street Journal wrote an article the other day that's pretty interesting. They said if you look at where job growth really occurs in America, when it happens at small business, the very smallest enterprise with 1, 2, 5, 10 people, that's where a lot of jobs come in. But unfortunately, that's where a lot of jobs also go. Those businesses start and they fail. Big business tends not to grow terribly much. What really grows, they said, are the businesses in between. The small businesses that start doing so well, they keep growing and growing and send products around the world. And what Sarbanes-Oxley did was it made it more and more difficult for those businesses, those in the middle, to secure the capital they need to grow. And so those businesses are being starved. They used to go to the public market and get people to encourage their growth. Instead, they're now finding it harder and harder to do that because of Sarbanes-Oxley. So look, big companies, they're doing just fine. They can even live with Sarbanes-Oxley because they've learned how to, and they've got reams of lawyers. Small businesses, largely financed through individuals and their sweat equity. But the middle market, it really is burdened under Sarbanes-Oxley. So look, it's not that we don't want any regulation. We don't want to tell the world that Republicans are against all regulation. No, regulation is necessary to make a free market work. but it has to be updated and modern, and it has to have as its objective not just finding the few bad guys, but also encouraging all the good guys. And that's what we've lost in Washington. Too many people think that business is bad. You know what? Corporations are made up of people. Employees, shareholders, customers, they're people. We want people to succeed, and our private sector is where that's going to happen.
Thank you, Mitt. I also, in this heavy